Absolutely. So for this text, it's been a collection of essays from what I've been reading. It's also been recently exhibited in the Guggenheim in New York. It's from AMO and Rem, and they're looking at a collection of writings about what countryside means now and how we lost the countryside in general, and how moving forward with this number of like 70% of people living in cities by 2050, what is going to happen to the countryside and how we can rediscover it, or how it's been rediscovered by people like technology companies and large industry and things like that. Things are growing our cities, so is it. And it's also just asking a lot of questions about what we can do with this countryside that has become almost an unknown region to a lot of people in their daily lives, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's two essays involved in this. There's one very small one, and then there's one larger one, but it's a collection of, I think, almost 15 in the entire book as well. I read a few of the rest of them as well. Yeah, they're very good. There's also that exhibition that was went on in the Guggenheim about this, and it was really quite interesting having a look at that as well. There's a catalogue of that open up somewhere on the internet. I can't really find where it was, but it's a really interesting one as well, thinking about like AI, and there's a lot of questions about what's like the future of agriculture a little bit as well in there, and like it really a lot of the questions at the end, I think, are there's pages and pages and pages of questions and question marks, which are really interesting to think about in some of them as abstracts, but also to pull out a few of them and think a bit more about them. I think it's really would be a really useful thing to talk about.
Yeah.
Do you want to take example or something, Connor? Do you want to?
One of the ones I was written down a few times was does nature now live in universities a little bit? And that one was, I think that's an interesting one, and the concept of how we're talking about nature and ecologies and things like that within our university degrees and in academics and things like that. But on the ground, it's still been hard to implement. If you even think about like my family are farmers down in like Offaly, and it's only now after years and years and years of academic research they're getting to like they have to like cut in a certain way to avoid corn crakes or something like that, or they're having to do certain ecological practices, but it's really slow to be introduced, I think. And I'm wondering if people are only really if the reality on the ground, especially in the countryside, isn't completely different from what people think it is in the city as well.
That was actually a thought that I had as well, about this divide between city and country that Rem was sort of proposing. Like this idea that there's one question that stuck out to me was it was a say where you said you can know a city, but can you know the countryside? And I thought it was really interesting because like it's actually like when you look into it, it's like a really profound epistemological question. Like, how do you know anything? What does it mean to know a city? And like, I think the fact that he said so definitively that you can know a city, like I found myself questioning that as much as saying like, can we know the countryside? Like, I think it's really interesting how you mentioned like now that there are certain ecological practices that should be followed in farming and stuff like that as well. And I think one of the like that's like the future aspect of it, like the future of farming. But one of the things that Rem was also mentioning was the past and past practices and stuff like that. And I again, like I don't really know what the key takeaway from all of these questions, like, because that was the main bit that I read was the piece titled question mark. And it seems like it's an interesting format for an essay for one thing. Like he does say it's like a one-sided conversation almost, and I found myself thinking about the questions, thinking about even more questions in response to the questions, and I don't know what the key takeaway from.
Yeah, I don't really know what to make of Rem's piece. I found that I wasn't really paying full attention to the countryside exhibition when it was when it was launched. But I mean, I was interested to, you see, like I thought Delirious New York was very interesting because I've lived in America for a long time, and I thought it was fascinating to read Rem Koolhaas's take on New York City, because in many ways it was one of those curious experiences where, you know, the way sometimes you read a book and somebody describes your entire life and your opinions and everything, you know, you're just captured there and you say, that's so me, and it resonates. But I found with Delirious New York that was really interesting that he was taking all of the facts about the history and the development of the place and how it came together and New Amsterdam and Wall Street and everything. And it was almost as if we were on parallel lines that just never touched. I mean, I understood what he was saying a lot of the time, but there was no sense of resonance there. I just thought we're at some level, something about our backgrounds or our cultures means that at some fundamental level, even though we're examining exactly the same material and we're almost arriving at the same conclusions, we're not in the same place. And I find something, I don't really know if I understand exactly what he's trying to do with this countryside exhibition. But I find as well that his take, his sort of fundamental look at this thing that's referred to as the countryside, which is, I just don't feel as, I don't know if him and me mean the same thing when we're talking about the countryside. I think Koolhaas is coming at it a little bit from, you know, the sort of the Emerson and Thoreau kind of tradition, the transcendentalist view of like the countryside, the wilderness is that which is not the city. And even though the transcendentalists said, you know, well, look, we're all at one with nature, in a sense they weren't. And, you know, in a sense what they're saying is they're always going back to the book of Genesis, you know, that man has dominion over this. And I'm not really sure, and I think that's what he's doing a lot of the time in this exhibition and with these writings. There's always this sense that man has dominion. And I wonder, is that the start? Is that like, is it a useful starting point? I'll shut up now.
Anyone else?
I think that's a good point, actually. Like it seems to me like as a kind of discussion of sort of nature. Well, there's a couple of things. It's kind of striking how he's kind of talking about modernity as being an inversion of the traditional relationship of nature and culture. And then the second thing seems to be with this sort of barrage of questions to kind of sum up everything, that the kind of everything becomes within the sort of region of architecture, but not in a kind of a practical way, in a kind of a theoretical way. So like, it seems to me like what he's trying to propose is sort of a theoretical response to a kind of a theoretical question. You know, the question of modernity is like a or the problems posed by modernity that are kind of spinning out of control. He's sort of kind of proposing that the response should be in the realm of system or theory rather than in kind of creative practice.
I think just maybe it's a little bit more like, one of the things that struck me was it felt like it was thinking about architecture in a different way. Like architecture, it was expanding this architecture, this idea of architecture as more than just buildings, but also something that is somehow linked to ideology. And I don't know if it's that it has a duty to ideology, or if it's intrinsically linked with ideology. Like another piece I read alongside this was a piece written by a student in London, an architecture student in London. It was a manifesto. I think I can't remember how I came across it, but one of the things that was discussing was how architecture can respond to the neoliberal agenda, and how neoliberalism and architecture, or how like our current architectural practices, i.e. of building, are forced to interact with the neoliberal agenda. And one of the arguments that other piece made was that maybe architecture, maybe the skills that we as architects learn in architecture school can be put to use in different ways, i.e. not to use buildings, but like we can spread a different message somehow. So like maybe building is not in fact the answer to this. And I think like Koolhaas kind of touches on something similar. Like there's a lot of hints to the question of ideology in that neoliberal agenda, where he talks a lot about like the free market and stuff like that. And I kind of think I wonder if he's questioning like how we practice architecture as well. Maybe it is we need to rethink what it is that architecture stands for and how we practice as architects, and how that sort of can reinforce a dominant culture or serve to tear it down.
I think that makes sense as well, but with especially the fact that in some parts he was talking about how these technology companies and things are building these huge sheds, and that they're being built without architects and things like this. So at this point, like the neoliberalism is almost coming full circle, and it's rejecting the architect and its new architecture. It's architecture without architects, built by and for technology. So but there's things there, a lot of those questions refer back to how technology can almost take over our jobs. Plainly, like it talks about how AI is being used in arts, and how it's designing its own space, and how it is the idea of AI is manipulating space and like all manner of the technology and the kind of structure of these companies and things that are working on it. And I think it's interesting now that almost, I don't know if we've dug our own grave in that we've made bed with this ideology, and then it's rejected us to the point where it's created something that can remove our importance in the process.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting that he left you cold, not so much you, Connor, but Gary and Steph both describe, and Tom, I think, to some extent, describe being not quite sure how to react to this text, to these texts. It seems to me that's quite intentional. I mean, if you look at the one about the trick, if you look at this, he goes, you know, it is post-human. There has been no architecture of a similar vigor in the last 100 years. It is based strictly on codes, algorithms, technologies, engineering, and performance. That's not intention. Its boredom is hypnotic. Its banality, breathtaking. What is he doing here? He's trying to, first of all, he's trying to have everything and be everything. And Zizek has a great line, spaghetti structuralism, which he uses in an essay, having a go at Umberto Eco. I went to a conference once all about pulp theory. It seems to me this is what this is. It's ticking all the boxes at the same time and saying nothing intentionally, making sure he covers, he's always there, always a cheerleader for everything and a critic of everything equally at the same time. Because there isn't any analysis. It's just a list. And it's actually unreadable. I mean, the hundreds of questions after where have the cows gone, I can't get beyond the first 5 of these, but I just have an aversion to lists. This is why I've never been able to find anywhere to live, because I've never been able to look through lists of apartments for rent. I've only ever been able to go by hearsay. So it's maddening. That's what it is. It's spaghetti structuralism. These guys got the idea that it was cool not to have a point of view. And the best time that I ever saw this still is David Byrne's film of 1986, True Stories. And he's driving around saying things like, superhighways are the Gothic cathedrals of our age. Or he even says in that film, you know, giant sheds not designed by architects are brilliant. Architects hate them because we don't need architects anymore. And that worked absolutely perfectly then. I don't understand why we're having to wade through this nonsense again. It was brilliant in the film with David Byrne, by the way. It's just how this can be presented as intellectual matter. I completely fail to see. I don't see how this relates to anything to do with production, and other than as token mentioning of. Sorry, Steph, you were going to say.
I think like there's 2 things about that. Like the thing that you mentioned about the length and the fact that you found it really hard to get through it. Like I did as well. And like part of me think like from a literary point of view, I feel like that's intentional. I feel like the fact that it is so long, the fact that it's almost impossible to go through, like that almost seems to me like a metaphor of the fact that there's so much that, like, we're in so deep into this mess of climate change as well, because he does talk a lot about that as well, and the fact that, like, I'm trying to find a quote, like he refers to it as it being such a big concept that we want to ignore. And I feel like that's almost exactly how you're looking at this list of questions as well. Like it's such a big thing that you can't make it through. And I know, like, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think that just perfectly represents exactly what he was trying to achieve with this. Like it's like 14 pages long or something like that. It's insane. And every question, you can look into every question that he lists is something like extremely profound. Like, you know, it's kind of like what Nazarene said last week about the text, the fact that it could be expanded upon for, like this could be a series of books. Like every question you could write a book about, I think.
The cumulative effect is of a bar stool bore who's just sitting there reeling out, and everything is fine. Yeah, occasionally something clever and so on, but with to what end? And you know, there's no dialogue. And plus the fact this we, he does try to address it in the first essay. Who is this we? You know, these statements about making the world a better place. We need to do this. We need to do that. Conor, do you? I mean, I've attacked it, and would you like to defend the text? I mean, I'd be interested if you were, like, because I got the feeling you got more out of it than I did.
I thought it was interesting as a jumping off point more than anything, especially the questions. It's as you were saying, like there's a lot of them which are they seem just filler, or they seem like there's the one in maybe 10 or 15 that's like really thought provoking for me at least, and it was really difficult to get through all of them, and I've skipped over a lot of them because some of them are in relation to each other. So you'll have maybe a string of 10 or 20 that are just the same question with like a single kind of item changed. I wouldn't defend it, but there is no dialogue on it. I think it's more as a piece to provoke thinking on it, on everything, which is, I don't know if it's useful in its own right, but it's certainly not critical of anything really. It's a statement of facts or a statement of questions.
Kate, you look like you're about to say something. I'm right. You are. Great.
Well, sorry. Oh yeah. Okay. Like this piece is taken out of its context. It accompanies an exhibition. So I think that's like, in a way, it's almost wrong to look at it on its own, because each question is supposedly answered within the exhibition as you go up the ramps of the Guggenheim. So that's in one way what makes reading the text uncomfortable, is because you're not getting any answers or clarity. And I found when reading the questions that some of the questions did kind of seem, oh yeah, like that will be answered visually. Like one of the questions, is the countryside shed becoming a model for all construction? When I read that question, I thought, oh, this is going to be a really exciting series of pastes, presumably, of how you might answer that question. But I actually didn't feel kind of untethered at the end of it. I actually quite liked reading the series of questions. And well, although you don't get an answer as such, I liked that because I thought a lot of the questions were really provoking. Actually, my favorite question was, how paralyzing is our current connectedness? I really liked that question. I never looked into the answer because I kind of don't want to know. But yeah.
I think that there's something on the countryside shed one as well, because that was one that caught my eye as well. And I mean, like, yes, there is, like you said, you can answer it visually as well. But I think there was something really nice to be able to imagine about that, because there's a couple of things that come to mind when you say the countryside shed. Like on the one hand, there's these big rectangular things that he's sort of semi-criticizing at the start as like not architecture, etc. But I think architects in a way that they have a tendency to also look at, like, particularly in Switzerland, these typologies, almost like the countryside typology. I know in Switzerland, like, you do get these wooden sheds that are like 300 and 400 years old, and I feel like I've had a conversation. I don't know if I'm I've had a conversation in the past with my uncle, who's an architect, about the sheds, and they're really interesting as building things. And I think it raises something that I've seen before about what do we include in the corpus of architecture. It's certainly something that Banham was raising in the text that we looked at a couple of weeks ago, of like, well, do you include everything in the corpus of architecture or not? And then you end up with this really interesting scenario of how do you decide what is architecture? Is a shed from 300 years ago architecture, but a shed from 2 weeks ago, is that not architecture? And what's the difference in how we see those things? It's almost like a cultural question as well, like what is the cultural importance of each of the respective structures?
Yeah, that is architecture without architects, maybe the one thing from it, that theme. But again, I say, this goes back to quite a long discussion of.
Yeah, people have been talking about this for years.
And all that.
Yeah, I have a feeling, it strikes me that maybe I don't know, I go off on one a little bit. It strikes me a little bit that, maybe 30 years ago, Rem Koolhaas and others would have been sort of at the heart of this discussion of the move toward urbanism and the move toward the urbanists who live in the cities, which was always sort of 2 parts science and 3 parts belief. And it seems to me that what he's doing here is he's really talking to that group of people, who he's had some second guessing. And what he's doing is he's trying to appeal to the people who have thought like him the last 30 or 40 years and speak this way and have these concerns. I don't really have very much maybe experience of the countryside, or maybe haven't read Norbert Schultz or that kind of thing, and he's trying to convince them with some very it's almost as if he's kind of like, if you keep asking a bunch of questions and the answer to most of them is yes, I agree, things are better, things are worse, yes, and then one question comes along and you say, well, I'm going to say, Rem, as an urbanist, I say no to that one, but you maybe say yes so often, I'm just going to say yes to you now. That he's sort of trying to convince a group of people who think a certain way to shift and move his direction. But essentially, it's the same coterie of people, it's the same demographic. And I'm certainly not part of
it. That's certainly something I felt when I was reading it as well, because I remember, like, I was reading about Rem as well, because admittedly I didn't know much, but like it kind of struck me that, like, as somebody who was probably well versed in that modernist that sort of like third wave modernism, almost, like it kind of struck me as like, okay, now you're coming around to all of these things, and like in a way, like all of these questions, like to me as a young person, again, I don't know if I see things a little bit differently just because there's a generational thing, but like it was surprising how much of the question still resonated with me, despite the fact that it did seem, like Gary was saying, that they're supposed to be rhetorical and to get people of Rem's demographic to perhaps shift their thinking. And I think like that kind of comes back to what I said previously as well about this idea that architecture is not necessarily, architecture might be not moving towards, but maybe the duty of architecture, the duty of an architect is to shift thinking now. Because it seems like, I don't know, it seems like that's something that is talked about a lot, like the duty of architecture and all of this social responsibility. It's like, how much of that is an ideological thing? And if we're looking at architecture and ideology, well, ideology is a thing that wants to be perpetuated and can't necessarily be perpetuated in the built environment. It has to be perpetuated. Like, it's almost a question of propaganda in a way. I don't know if that's seeing things a little bit too much.
Tom, you were going to say something.
Yeah, it's just slightly separate take. It seems to me it's kind of fundamentally about sort of simulation or something, isn't it? Like
simulation.
Yeah.
Simulacrum. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that nature is just we just have simulated nature with nature reserves, and even cities are kind of simulated environments, obviously. And he kind of touches on that. I think that's the kind of one. That's where there were a couple of points where I kind of became a bit more interested. And in the first chapter, The Ignored Realm, he kind of talks about cities as, you know, even new cities, we kind of know them already. And then, you know, the sort of, he's kind of talking about trying to order what's left over into these kind of zones, or these simulated environments, you know, that are supposed to be wilderness or something else. But that ultimately this is a kind of a task for planning or something, you know, that the sort of approach to the crisis is something that's going to be ordered by a kind of a planning, which kind of leaves me a bit worried. Anyway, that's I suppose the central point is really about simulation, and I don't know if anybody has any expertise in that area.
I would say that, like, this idea of simulation, I think to extend that as well, it's like, it's questioning how we see things, and like it's almost highlighting that our current understanding of the countryside is a simulation, as in it's not I don't know if it's a simulation. It's like, it's not necessarily rooted in factual basis, but there's also a question of, like, what is factual, because, like, I think coming back to, like, what Connor said at the start of, like, that there's this imperative of certain ecological practices that should be followed, should be done, but then there's also the question of what was done previously. Like, I've read a lot about farming practices in Ireland and how they exist before in a arguably more sustainable way. Now, I don't know if that was just looking at it as like romanticizing past relations of production. I know, Mark, you've been critical of that idea before, but I think there is something to be said about looking at the information that we did know and didn't know. And I think that's something that Rem sort of brings up as well. He talks a lot about, like, the Romans, and how did the Romans see the divide between city and countryside as well, and did they have a model for understanding that? Did they have a model for dividing that up?
I'm going to just say, it's not so much he's a bar room. I really more I think about this, the more I'm pissed off, you know, impatient I suppose I get with it. Not that he's so much as a bar room bore, but, you know, and this is with the greatest of respect to youthful enthusiasts who I have had the pleasure of working with for years, in the students who will get interested in things. And I retain a lot of this kind of amateur, if you like, enthusiasm for things in myself. But the way he just plucks these things, this way of plucking things and jumping from one thing to another. Have you noticed this style? It's not rooted in any analysis of history. This is why I call it structuralism light, or spaghetti structuralism.
I agree.
It doesn't have any. It's not rooted in a real. The rootedness that I'm looking for is not that I believe it's terrible, this is bad, or this is good, or that is the other, but rather some idea that there is. It's not cities and countryside. It's the world. There's massive production of nature. You know, and there has been for a very long time, and there are certain crises around this. And the countryside is an ideal, isn't it? It's a kind of a mythical place to a large extent. I mean, nature has been produced and reproduced in human production cycles for a very long time in different ways. And so it just feels that this is all just being laid out as a sort of just like that, Kate, you were saying, part of an exhibition, part of the kind of decoration of an exhibition. I'm just criticizing this as intellectual work because I just don't see him picking on something and then going through it rigorously.
Is it intellectual work or artistic work, though?
That's what it is. It's artistic work, and that's why we call it spaghetti structuralism, and why David Byrne did it really well in a movie with Pop Songs, because it's almost like it's a clever position to try and get beyond the grand narratives, to try and get beyond the impasse of the failure of the grand narratives of, you know, Marxism or classical economics or the big heavyweight things. Structuralism became part of late Marxism and had its own contributions and has its serious roles to play in sociology, for instance, and in other fields. But ultimately, it can be turned into a kind of a position of no positions, whereas all you're doing is, it's like that, you know, remember, you're all too young. I'm the oldest by far. The generation game where people were looking at the presents going by them and they had to remember as many as they could. And they could
I remember very, very well.
Yes, you and Gary. And
we are of the same generation.
You remembered all these things. You'd get to take them home with you. And it feels like that. It's not even, it's just that it's really boring. It's fine when he's a short essay. It's when he gets into his lists, it just, why would you go on reading it? It's just listening to a list. Occasionally a clever thing, maybe.
He's trying, I mean, obviously what he's trying to do there is because he can't, there is no rigor in his argument or no discipline. I mean, I find it extraordinary that he asks about the Roman relationship with the countryside, but not a word about the Greeks. I think it's just amazing. Like, you know, there's not a mention of the word polis once. And if he was serious about, now there may be in other aspects of the exhibition that I haven't seen, but I've seen bits and pieces of it. I mean, I think, Mark, you're right. I think if he was serious about trying to engage in a discussion about, like, what is this thing that we call, some people refer to the countryside or whatever, you know, this thing that is not, that we all know is no longer the city, and how do we talk about it, and how do we address it, or how do we reframe our thinking, or whatever it is that needs to be done. It strikes me that, you know, it's very childish. You know, if you were doing a thesis on this in third year or fifth year, we'd be saying, Rem, you got to go back and look at your sources and do your literature review and come back with your analysis and find out who said what, and talk to me a little bit about Koolhaas before you get into the, you know, and you'd be saying, and you better read your Norbert Schultz, and then you better know something a little bit about, you know, not all nature is Area 52. Some of it is the Grand Basket, and some of it is the south of France, and some of it's other places. You know, you really have to get in underneath this thing. And if you want to convince me that I've got to sit down and have a discussion with you. Now, the way to get around that a little bit is to say, well, I'm not making a structured argument. I'm making a poetical one. And the problem here is that he can't write poetry. He just can't. He can't engage in the poetic sense. And that if there is an excuse for this list of questions, I think the only one that we could really say is that it's an attempt to persuade us with you know, artful sounds, and it's not there. You know, he just doesn't have that touch.
I think there's something that might reinforce that view as well, like, because I know, like we've kind of determined we don't think this is an intellectual piece, or it doesn't seem to have particular intellectual rigor, and like it's an artistic piece if it is anything, but it's also not poetry. It's not really artistic. And it also, in the exhibition, I saw,
I think we need to drag him into this conversation and make him give it an account for himself, Mark. Instead,
again, you broke up a little bit. We need to drag it. Say it again, Gary.
I think we need to call Rem and ask him to come join us in this conversation and give an account of himself.
anybody have his phone number?
What you say, Connor?
Well, actually, yeah, one of our students is working with it. One of our former students is working with him in New York. So but no, I suppose I find it frustrating. Go ahead, Mark. Yeah.
Sorry, Gary. You finished. I cut across you.
No, I find it a bit frustrating. I find that you know, this is somebody who's written things in the past. I've heard him speak, where he's well capable of making, you know, of using that little surgical scalpel to get at a point when he needs to. And this time he's not doing it. It's hard to know why. It's hard to know, is it a PR exercise? Is it something that he sat down with a group of people, you know, in advertising, who said, you know, if you want people to get more interested in this countryside thing you're talking about, don't use this word, use that word. You know, don't get polemical, don't write a manifesto. Pose it as a series of questions, and that'll get people to go along with you. It sort of feels like, you know, maybe it was proposed, you know, it came through that kind of mode of thinking, because without sort of trying to justify it that way, I can't understand how somebody would, you know, we all get ideas for things that we should write. You know, we're coming home in the car from work and we're thinking, oh, I think I'll write a piece about this or that. But then after a day or two, we realize that there's probably a very good reason not to write this. You know, it's not that interesting. It's been done before, or the point you're going to make isn't interesting as he thought it was the first day. And I feel that this little essay here is one of those things that might have been better, you know, just put to one side. And I just don't know. I don't know why it made it to print. It's very hard to understand.
You don't think there's anything to take away from it then?
It's meant to leave you.
I suppose, Steph, I'd be taking more away from. I keep thinking about where's this man coming from? What's he trying to do here? And so I'm kind of maybe questioning his motives as a well-known architect, somebody who's very influential and has contacts with all sorts of people and can organize. If he decides to have an exhibition in the morning, I have to ask my family, is it okay? Can I have an exhibition in our garage? And they might say no. But if he wants to have an exhibition in the morning and he calls up the Guggenheim, they say yes, you know, that he's a very, you know, he's an influential person, particularly in the States. You know, he's quite well known there in a broader sense than he would be here. And I just wonder, I find myself questioning, I think the takeaway is to question his motives.
Well, I think his motives are pretty clear, but I think how we label those motives might be more interesting. Like, I feel like you're suggesting that, like, this in and of itself could be ideological perpetuation. This could be a tool for peddling a certain ideology. Even though it's not necessarily an intellectual piece, it does, in some of the questions, it feels like I said previously, like it is hinting towards a more ideological, to a sort of more hidden ideological question that I don't know if it threatens our architecture or if it needs to be dealt with by architecture, but it is at least relevant to architecture.
An ideological.
Mark, you were going to say something.
An ideology, in another sense, is well, not it's probably it's related sense, but you know that Marx's idea of ideology is that it's to do with how the ideas of the ruling class become ruling ideas. That's where he began that study of ideology, beginning with religion in Germany. Frederick Jameson has a way, you know, a famous essay called Postmodernism, the cultural logic of late capitalism. And I think the work of Koolhaas fits nicely into that. I mean, on the one hand, he does exhibitions on, and he seems to actually offer some social, you know, he appears to be genuine, and he was going to run for a social democratic candidate in Holland, and he has done various projects to focusing, like this one, focusing on ignored realms and on dispossessed people and problems and so forth. And on the other hand, he's doing the CCP TV Centre and massive projects around the world. And that would be that cultural logic of late capitalism. It's always been a problem for architecture. It's always been a condition of architecture that it's ideological in that way, that it's looking for the biggest clients, the most powerful clients. The problem is how to be a ruling idea. That's always the problem of ideology. How to be an idea that everyone feels applies, that's in their benefit. So he has to keep, you know, making these exhibitions and publications in order to not be seen as this star architect merely servicing the ultra elites. And that's how I see this. I mean, that means I'm ascribing fairly cynical motives to him, but not necessarily. It's postmodernist. And that's why structuralism, that technique of not taking one position, but not taking any position, just you know, doing continual about turns in his descriptions.
I think there's a certain merit to that, though, in this. Like, he's not taking a position, but I think one of the things that he's raising in all of these questions is that there's no clear position to take, especially with regards to climate change.
There is actually. I mean, sorry, Steph. I mean, that was the first rule there. First of all, I didn't let you finish, so you're wrong. No, I think there's positions that can be taken which are part of those narratives. Either you say production of nature, you know, must be opposed when it is for the benefit of an elite, let's say, or you have another position which is explicitly in favor of the market as a form of nature. I mean, the physiocrats, this is a group, that led to Adam Smith and classical economics. They really believed, and this is still a very current view, that somehow or other the market is a natural phenomenon. And we can get to this, back to this, to the basis of remove all of the things that stop it working perfectly, then it will actually solve all problems because it's grounded in some natural model. And so there are these narratives. I really think his position is against narratives. That's why I call it structural or post-structuralist. It's a position in which what he says is what really important is, just talking about it. And because the talking about it can be disconnected from the thing itself, which is what allows him to take so many opposing positions all the time.
I think the problem is, like what I was saying, was not that there's not a position to take. Like there are obviously positions that can be taken, but I think the big question is like, what is the correct position to take on this issue? And I think that's where I was coming. Like it's not that there's not a position to take, but it's like, how do we find this correct position? I think that's another reason why there's more questions than there are statements. Not more questions. It is only questions and not statements, because like to make a statement, it kind of comes back to this quote. I think Al Gore talked about it, like to act or to not act. I don't know, he was talking about this dichotomy between acting and not acting, where not acting is an irresponsible thing, but also to act could also be an irresponsible thing, especially if we don't have all of the information. Like you end up in this situation where like, okay, you're acting, like this situation that we're in with, like, we have to plant more trees, we have to plant trees at all costs, but then you end up like the situation up in Scotland at the moment, where there is so many trees that it has absolutely destroyed all of their wetlands in favor of economics. Yes, and like there is a thing to be said about, like, okay, there's more trees, that's a positive thing, but like it's not black and white and it's not clear. And I think the fact that he's not taking a position.
Seth, I just want to remind you and us and all of us, this is in the context of architectural theory. And the real problem here is a serious problem, which is that architecture, in doing its job, is not addressing social or climate issues. It can, we can argue that it could, but that the forces of production exist there anyway. And great things. And this is part of what he's trying to do in his essay about the trick, the warehouses in the countryside, is to sort of look at, this is what's happening regardless of us architects. So, but what he's trying to do in his work is he's trying to extend architecture to cover all of those things through his discourse, through his exhibition, through his writings about it. The only way he can do it is by these gymnastics, carelessness, if you like, of positioning, just like throwing things out and jumping from this to that and the other and taking opposing positions at the same time. But the purpose of it is to produce a cultural artifact, this exhibition, this writing, which fits, which becomes part of the ideology. In other words, it becomes part of the ideas of the ruling class, because everything is possible. Everything can be encouraged. Everything is equally good. There's no opposition. It's almost like, I really believe Koolhaas, possibly Denise Scott Brown at the very beginning, and Venturi, ran up the surrender flag to the idea that architecture could intervene in production. I mean, at the time of the Bauhaus, the idea, and the Deutsche Werkbund before that, the idea of architectural intervention in production was widely held, that architecture could really take part in making the world better. Now, it survives as a green energy idea, and passive house and all of those things is undeniable. But I think his ambition is way more than that. He's trying to be a seer, a true architecture, to have things to say about nature and industry. But I don't think he does. He doesn't actually have anything to say about it. He just wants to expand his prerogative. Sorry, I realized I was really just terrible at that, and nobody can understand what I'm saying, and I accept all of this. I just think this is postmodern. This is disconnected fundamentally, and it's to do with language.
Yeah, I agree with that, Mark. I think that's the reading. Yeah.
Okay. I think like I agree with you on a lot of that, and I think like you've pointed out something which I think really got to me, really still does get to me, like this idea that architects see themselves with all of this duty and responsibility, whereas realistically in our current modes of practicing architecture we can't achieve all of the things that we claim we have responsibility to do, i.e. this imperative towards social change, and this imperative almost against postmodernism, like this idea that like, okay, we want to build houses, we want to provide houses to people, like fundamental. We have to engage with this capitalist system, which is built on principles of exploitation, in order to achieve the things that we claim to be social. And realistically, the fact that we're engaging with that system undermines our entire like idea of what we're actually doing. And that's where I think, like, again, I don't know if Koolhaas is actually arguing this, but that's what I was mentioning. The other piece that I was reading alongside it was like, maybe in order to achieve these things that we wish to achieve, or we claim to wish to achieve, we don't, maybe practicing architecture must expand beyond building. Maybe it's not just built environment. Maybe it is ideological. It is political, and the fact that it is political means it must extend beyond just buildings.
He did say a few years ago he was going to run for politics, Koolhaas.
Mm-hmm.
Which, by the way, would have been him, technically, just to note, that would have been him attempting, and could have succeeded in transferring. What do you do when you go to a bank and you change dollars into euros? What's the word? God, exchanging his architectural capital for political capital, hoping to turn one thing into the other. And he could have, because he's such a big architect, such a well-known person, it would have given him an immediate platform and voice, publicity and so on. So he could have leveraged his culture.
Yeah, but Steph, just to get back to a point you made there, just about kind of theory, that practice sort of moves into theory as a way to address things. I think like that's kind of what Rem Koolhaas is doing there. For me, he's kind of suggesting that it's only a theoretical approach that can, be adopted now. Like, it's the kind of opposite of, think globally and act locally. That kind of approach. That's the only approach really open to anyone. And it's kind of interesting to me that he doesn't mention creativity at all in the whole essay. That is like personal, the personal response, or the response of the individual, kind of through practice and engagement. What the role of that is in the whole system. So, like, to me, what's kind of scary about the essay is that it's only about theory. It's only about kind of planning as a sort of zoning land for different things as the solution, which, like, to me, that's the kind of problem. That's the kind of subjugating humanity to systems is really where we're coming from.
I would agree with you there as well. And I think that this move towards theory is actually precisely the problem. Like, it's not really what I'm arguing for. I think, like, maybe there's a new mode of practice. Like, there's different ways that we can apply our expertise, because, like, I don't want to sound bad about this, but I think architects make terrible theorists. We're not educated to do so. Like, our education doesn't give us the tools in order to do that. Like, if we wanted to see ourselves as theorists, if we wanted to practice theorists, then we'd actually look at things like anthropology, and we'd look at actually like corpuses of knowledge that exist outside of architecture. And I feel like architects that claim to be theorists oftentimes don't actually do that. I think architects might make terrible theorists, but I think there is a certain thing that we learn how to do in architecture. Like, we learn how to visually represent things. We learn, like, there's an artistic sense to what we do as well. And I feel like that is something that we should be drawing in upon to unite with theorists, rather than trying to be theorists ourselves. Like, this whole idea of praxis, actually applying the things that we know. And, like, currently architects apply the things that we know in making buildings, and maybe there's a different way in doing praxis.